Well, good evening, and welcome to this penultimate class on the 2016 election. Just when we thought we had seen it all. And as you know, we will regather not next week, not election night, but 2 weeks from tonight we'll be here and try to make sense of whatever the conclusion of this epic saga turns out to be. So, to say the obvious, what everybody here knows, we're just 1 week away from completing what has to be acknowledged, I think, as one of the most bizarre electoral cycles in this nation's history. But I'm afraid that we are a much longer distance than 1 week away from absorbing the shocks and wounds that have been inflicted on our body politic over the last many months. And since, as you now know, I'm an historian and I try to see everything through an historical lens, let me put the point still more broadly. How will future historians explain how we came to this? And how will they assess those shocks and wounds that this society has suffered over the last many years, even decades, not just in this cycle? And how will they tell the story of this particular cycle's sequelae? So in a recent New Yorker article that I strongly commend to all of you, in the October 31st edition of the New Yorker, George Parker has an unusually excellent article about where we are. And I'm going to quote a couple of sentences from it because for me they do a good job of framing these issues in a very good way. So, as Parker puts it, the fact that so many informed, sophisticated Americans failed to see Donald Trump coming and then kept writing him off is itself a sign of a democracy in which no center holds. Most of his critics are too reasonable to fathom his fury-driven campaign. Many don't know a single Trump supporter. But to fight Trump, you have to understand his appeal. Now, I won't venture to guess how many people in this room tonight are ready either to fight or support Donald Trump. I could make an educated guess, but I won't. But I will bet that most of us in these deep blue Bay Area precincts know very few, if any, Trumpistas. And I dare say that Packer is describing many of us in this room when he talks about those supposedly informed sophisticates who did not see Trump coming. So for most of us, I think it takes both a dose of humility and a fairly daring leap of political imagination to fully understand our current situation. Now, in our defense, it might be added that we're all engaged with this class, at least in part, to understand the Trump phenomenon. But I think it's not just Trump's personality that should preoccupy us, but much more importantly, what is it that has given all those millions of people who have rallied to him their faith in his figure? Those people are, after all, our fellow citizens, and they are not going away after November 8th. As George Packer in the article I'm commending to you goes on, he says, "A disaster on this scale belongs to no single set of Americans, and it will play out long after the November election, regardless of the outcome." And here's the sentence that really arrested my attention. Trump represents the whole country's failure. The whole country's failure. So let's take that accusation seriously and let it inform our discussion this evening. Some of you are of an age where you might remember the pithy dictum that the cartoonist Walt Kelly famously put in the mouth of his character Pogo. We have met the enemy and he is us. So in that spirit of humility and daring, tonight's class provides an occasion for some self-examination and some soul-searching, painful as it might be. And it also provides an occasion, tonight does, for some retrospection on the themes that have preoccupied us together over the last month. First, the way that the Constitution, money, the media, and the evolution of political parties have shaped or arguably distorted our modern-day electoral process. Second, the national security and foreign policy challenges that will confront the next president, whoever that person might be. Third, the widening wealth and income gaps and concomitant narrowing of the avenues of opportunity for young people in particular that have emerged in the last generation or two. And fourth, as we saw last week, the dizzying changes, largely driven by technology and globalization, that are in the process of reshaping the American workplace almost beyond recognition. And to bring us back to our announced subject this evening, this election season also provides us an especially robust stimulus to do some thoughtful rumination about the nature of democracy itself, and especially about our own peculiarly American version of democracy. What is the essence of democracy? What is its history? Has its history in this country deepened and amplified its essence? Or has it compromised or even betrayed that essence? And of course, again, our subject this evening, what is its future? So just to get the discussion going, I'm going to suggest that there are three necessary elements that compose democracy and that might provide a framework for our discussion. First, this is Civics 101, no rocket science here, but just to refresh our memories. First, as the Greek root of the word suggests, democracy puts the people at the heart of the matter. Democracy is based on popular consent, on the premise that the ultimate and singular source of legitimacy and authority is the people. Realistically speaking, in a society of more than 300 million citizens, that means the people exercising their authority through their elected representatives who are accountable to the people through the electoral process. Two, democracy is predicated on the principle of equality. That is to say, it makes no distinction of rank or privilege in social affairs. Those of you who recollect Huckleberry Finn will remember the passage where they talk about a country with no dukes or dauphins. And more seriously, in theory at least, democracy tolerates no differences amongst citizens in access to political power or to the avenues of advancement. Three, at least in the American case, this may be a special attribute of our version of democracy, but here I think democracy also affirms the principle of inclusion. That is, admission to full social membership, including, of course, the rights and privileges of citizenship, to anyone who affirms his or her allegiance to those antecedent principles of popular rule and equality. Now, in practice, that commitment to inclusion strongly implies yet another value that's salient with us, and that is a commitment to tolerance, mutually extended by and to peoples of different creeds and colors in ways of life, so long as they accept the basic terms of the American social contract. So, the authority of the people, equality, and inclusion, that's my version of the holy trinity of American democracy. Now, my own examination of conscience, to go back where I began, about these questions, carries me back to some of the sacred texts in the great American canon. Four in particular: the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, the Constitution, and notably the preamble of the Constitution, and the most trenchant commentary ever written about this nation's political culture, Alexis de Tocqueville's classic from the 1830s, Democracy in America. So first, the Declaration. I take a special note of the latter part of that famous sentence about certain truths being self-evident. And I'll pass over here the well-known passage about men being created equal and all of them endowed with certain inalienable rights. The passage that interests me for purposes of our discussion this evening comes immediately after that. It says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers, just powers, from the consent of the government. And again, the word that gets my attention there is the word government. From the outset of our nation's history, our identity as a people and as a nation was intimately bound up with a democratic form of government. Indeed, foreign visitors to the United States in the 19th century, from Charles Dickens to André Tardieu to José Martí, repeatedly griped about the way that Americans never stopped crowing about their government. In short, for a long historical season, well into the 20th century, Americans took pride in their government, and indeed it formed a touchstone of their national identity. They bragged about it. They cited it as the thing that distinguished them from other peoples, and it, to repeat, gave them a common sense of identity, and led hundreds of thousands of them to lay down their lives so that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. Now note what Lincoln did not say on that historic occasion. He did not say that free markets or capitalism or even American global leadership should not perish from the earth, but popular government. Now, not to belabor the obvious, but I will anyway. Those kinds of sentiments are a far cry from the declaration that government is not the solution, government is the problem. That message has informed much of our political life for nearly 2 generations, enfeebling government, especially the federal government, to a degree that prompts the likes of Tom Friedman to pray, if only we could be China for a day. So here's my first question for our panelists this evening, and Larry Kramer, I'm looking at you in particular. What has democracy come to when the performance of its apparently chronically catatonic institutions prompts even liberal thinkers like Friedman to pine for the efficacy of an authoritarian and notoriously repressive regime? So my next text is the Constitution's preamble, especially its opening words, which we all know. We, the people of the United States. Now, those words not only reaffirm the Declaration's statement that the only legitimate form of government is one based on the consent of the government, but in addition, that phrase, we the people, has also been endlessly invoked to define the master narrative of American history, one we all grew up on, that our story, our nation's vector through time, is about the ever-expanding circle of we the people. We pride ourselves on being a nation that has long welcomed immigrants, on being the first nation to enfranchise all adult white males without reference to property holding or title, on being a people willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives to extend the franchise to all adult males regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, on eventually extending the franchise to all adults tout court regardless of gender, and in our own lifetime to offer full social membership to gays, lesbians, and transgender people. So here's my second question for our guests. It's actually a set of questions. What has happened to make us wary of our own tradition as an immigrant people? What forces have given rise to a presidential candidate who preaches exclusion, not inclusion, and who apparently pins his electoral hopes on the narrow demographic of less educated white men? And perhaps most disquieting, Arlie Hochschild, I'm looking at you in particular, what has driven so many millions of our countrymen and countrywomen to such a state of despondency that they will not even bother to vote, and that so many of them feel so alienated from the very institutions that were once a source of national pride and identity? So my final text is from Alexis de Tocqueville. A bit of background is to remind you. Tocqueville is customarily credited with expanding the science of political study to include not just formal institutions and statutes and jurisprudence, but equally, or even more importantly, the underlying beliefs and values and mores and behaviors of people who inhabit the society at large. Tocqueville gave to those things the collective name habits of the heart. He came to America as a 26-year-old young man in 1831, spent 9 months traveling the country, went home and wrote the 2-volume work that today stands as probably the single best commentary ever written about the conditions of American democracy. Here is the first sentence of that classic work, entitled simply Democracy in America, the sentence which lays down a foundational observation from which all the rest of his analysis through the following 2 volumes will flow. And he said, "Amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of condition among the people. I readily discovered the prodigious influence which this primary fact exercises on the whole course of society. It gives a peculiar direction to public opinion and a peculiar tenor to the laws. It imparts new maxims to the governing authorities and peculiar habits to the governed." So here's another question for our panelists, and Peter Wehner, here I'm looking at you in particular. Can American democracy survive in the context of gross and growing inequality? What forces have so stressed our social fabric and political culture that we seem at the moment no longer to conceive ourselves as a people bound together by agreement to a shared set of norms, values, and expectations? How can we explain the polling data that has documented, unarguably, the steady decline over the last 2 generations of our trust and confidence in institution after institution, including the Congress, the presidency, the courts, the political class generally, the media, big league sports, even the churches and the Boy Scouts. So, the authority of the people is exercised through representative government, equality, and inclusion. That's my holy trinity. And as I've already noted, we have with us for this evening our retrospective and prospective discussion of our political fate, three deeply engaged contributors to our public life and our effort to understand ourselves in this confusing passage in the Republic's history. So on behalf of Jim Steyer and Rob Reach, my co-instructors, and I presume on behalf of all of you, I welcome our guests to this platform and thank them for making the effort to be with us. So first is Larry Kramer. He is currently the president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, where he has been since 2012. And before going to lead Hewlett, Larry served 8 years as dean of the Stanford Law School, where he emphasized curricular reforms that promoted a public service ethos. He has been a professor of law at the University of Michigan and at New York University, as well as the University of Chicago, where he got his law degree. He clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, and his research and teaching have been deeply invested in constitutional law, including, I happen to know because he has occasionally invited me to teach in it, an annual seminar on that subject that he offers for high school teachers. Arlie Hochschild is professor of sociology emerita at UC Berkeley, where she received her graduate training after graduating from Swarthmore, and where she has taught for almost as long as I have taught at Stanford. That's 49 years in my case, Arlie. Have I got you outnumbered or not?
Yeah, get there.
Okay. Yeah. Her research interests have long focused on the relation of, this can be my description of your work, Arlie, you can correct me if I got it wrong, but the relation of person to persona, or private life to public performance, or more broadly on the ways that individual character and social and historical context are inextricably interconnected. She's well known to a broad public far beyond the academy through works like The Second Shift, Working Parents and the Revolution at Home. And her current book, a copy of which I just happen to have here, is entitled Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, A Journey to the Heart of Our Political Divide. It's the result of several years of researching and living among the citizens of Louisiana Bayou country, and she's here tonight to help us understand why they have the political attitudes that they do. The New York Times reviewer described this book as generous, disconcerting, smart, respectful, and compelling. And it is a nominated finalist for the 2016 National Book Award. Good luck. Peter Wehner is currently a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., which describes its mission as dedicated to applying the Judeo-Christian moral tradition to critical issues of public policy. Peter has served in 3 Republican administrations, those of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, where in that last capacity he headed the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives, and where I first met him just about 10 years ago. He is the co-author of 2 notable books, City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, co-authored with Michael Gerson, and Wealth and Justice, The Morality of Democratic Capitalism, co-authored with Arthur C. Brooks. Peter is currently a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, where he writes, in my opinion, uncommonly thoughtful commentaries on our current cultural and political scene, and where he has used his platform to separate himself from Donald Trump and worry a lot about the future of the Republican Party. So again, I welcome our guests to the platform this evening, and I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion.
So I will start, and I'll start by taking David up on the invitation to step back from the election and take a sort of broader, deeper look at what has gone wrong with the political system to produce the polarization that we have today. And so, and in doing so, I think what I'm going to do is add a 4th value to the 3 that David laid out that are essential to democracy. So polarization is really an outcome. It's not a cause of it. It describes a phenomenon. The real cause here is and this would be the value that I would add, which is the loss of the ability to compromise. And the fact of the matter is, in any complex democracy, that is essential to make it work. It is actually our particular nation was constructed deliberately around the notion that we were going to extend the republic, take in a great number of interests, and create a system where they would have to compromise with each other. And the inability that we have arises when that capacity breaks down. Now, the question is why? What has happened for the first time in American history to make it just impossible to achieve the kinds of compromises within the government that are necessary to make it function? So I'll have to touch on this very quickly, obviously, because it's a complex story. But let's start by saying it is not a product of bad people in government. It is not a product. There are a handful, actually, of people in Congress who really are not interested at all in compromising. But the vast majority of the members of Congress, if you talk to them in private, and most of them are public about this, really are eager to find ways to work with people on the other side in order to get things done. So if it's not a product of bad people, what we're really talking about is something that is a product of long-term secular trends. Actually, I guess that's redundant. Secular trends that have manifested themselves in institutional structures that make it virtually impossible to do that, even if you want to. So let me touch on some of the main ones. The largest one really has been an ideological sorting that has taken place within the core political structures, and in particular the political parties. So we've gone from a world in which each of the parties were ideologically mixed. They may have predominated a little bit one way, but each of the party had ideological people with different ideological persuasions, into one in which essentially all liberals are Democrats, all conservatives are Republicans. And as that has happened, the ability then to sort of, in the old days, I could count on most of my party coming along because we were of the same party, and I could get enough people on the other side because we shared an ideology, to making that fact itself very much more difficult. And that has been exacerbated out in the polity, which is now equally polarized, by a similar sorting in terms of where people live. So it's not that people don't actually sort of look for neighborhoods with other liberals or other conservatives, but what makes someone liberal or conservative maps onto other things that people share in common. And so the neighborhoods and the communities have sorted very much the same way, and that has a natural effect in terms of who the office holders are and the amount of freedom that they actually have when they move to Congress. This sorting process is not something new. It actually began in the 1960s. You get the civil rights laws, and Nixon comes along and realizes that he has a way to hive off conservative Democrats in the South who aren't really Democrats, who've only been voting Democratic because they're still angry about the Civil War. And he runs a campaign and begins a slow process, that does not happen quickly, over 30 years of essentially converting all of the conservative Southern Democrats into Republicans. As the Republican Party becomes more conservative, it becomes less hospitable to liberal Republicans in the North who become Democrats. And that's sort of the way the process folds out over a long period of time. Now that sorting has then been exacerbated by a set of institutional obstructions that grew out of it, have been placed on top of it, that make it even harder for people to compromise, that make sense within a world in which you have this sorting that reinforce it. There's a whole lot of these. Most of them are changes inside Congress itself. Things like first the Hastert rule and then the modification of the Hastert rule to essentially say the majority party has to be the party to pass the legislation. Right? That we will not pass legislation if we require votes from the other side in order to do so, to changes in the filibuster rule, roll call rules, just a whole slew of rules inside Congress, as well as changes in the work week so that members of Congress aren't there anymore, they don't get to know each other, and so on. So that's one set of changes. A second set of changes turn around primary elections, which is where the candidates are picked. And so by the time you get to the general election, it doesn't so much matter if the primaries have sorted into giving you people who are at the extremes of each party. Right? And so that's driven largely by, first, incredibly low voter turnout in primaries. The voter turnout is typically 15 to 20%, which means it's people from the extremes of the party. That then is exacerbated on top of that by campaign finance. And the real place where campaign finance plays out is in the primary elections, not in the general election, where you have money from both sides, and it tends to roughly balance. But in the primary election, you have a lot of ideological money that can have a powerful effect because you have a tiny little electorate. And so all of that tends to hold the candidates off on the side. And whatever you do then after that, if you want to get renominated again, that's when people talk about being primaried. And then lastly, and again, there are others, but these I think are the main ones, has been the effect of media fragmentation and social media. Right, so that you no longer have these kind of general centrist media. You have media on each side that on the one hand will hold you accountable if you do not adhere to party orthodoxy, and on the other hand, if you don't, we'll give a loud voice to the person who's going to run against you who does. So that set of factors has tended to sort of push people off and hold them in place. And those pressures toward the fringes have particularly over the last 15 or 20 years, turned, and this is largely, I think, the social media piece of it and what's happened in the electorate leading up to the candidates, but they've turned political opposition into a kind of tribalism, where it's no longer, these are not ideological opposition. The truth is, neither of the two political parties is remotely ideologically coherent any longer, right? What it is though, what I am is not them. Right? There was a recent survey that came out that shows that today more people would be more upset if their kid married someone of the other political party than they would be if their kid married someone of a different race or religion. And that's a kind of astonishing fact if you think about it. But it then means we're going to just hold to this mostly because we're on our side, you're on your side, we hate you, you are against this country, and so on. And that's true across both sides. Okay. Now, all that, I should say, and I'll just make a couple of observations because I don't want to take more than 5 or 6 minutes. This is the uniquely US version of something that is unquestionably happening globally, right? I mean, it plays out differently in every country, but there are these underlying drivers that are a product of a different set of global secular trends, including trade, immigration, the economic dislocations that those have created, cultural dislocations that follow from it, migration, all of those things which create a set of anxieties that, as I say, they express themselves differently institutionally in every country, but it's not surprising that we see similar things across the globe. That's on the large scale. On the small scale, I think it's important to see this particular election is not unexpected. I can say honestly, last December I gave a talk in which, this was in France, in which I predicted that I thought Trump very likely would get the nomination. I should say, for reasons I'm happy to talk about later, I actually hoped he would. I didn't expect the campaign to be quite as vile as it became, but for reasons I'll talk about in a second. The main thing is just to recognize that this, as strange as it seems, is really a not unexpected manifestation of these long-term trends that have been happening since the mid-late 60s and just growing straight across. So last word, let me just say, is there a way to fix this? And I think the answer is yes. But the heart of it is to recognize that what we need to do is rebuild the capacity to compromise. And a lot of the alienation that you see, most of it comes from when government does nothing. That will get people more upset, in effect, than when government does something they disagree with. Particularly if sometimes they're winning, sometimes they're losing, which is what you normally have when you have a robust set of compromises. But when government does nothing, that's going to alienate people, and the people who are losing the most are not surprisingly going to get the most alienated. So we need to rebuild the capacity to compromise inside the government. So how do we do that? So the first thing is there's going to need to be a resorting. Right? And that is something that you can't engineer that. But what I believe is that will happen naturally, as it has happened all across American history as the issues change. And to some extent, one of the silver linings in this election campaign, as awful as it is you can see the beginnings of it in the fracture lines that emerged on both sides and in both parties, where not only are there divisions within the parties being expressed strongly for the first time, but a lot of those divisions actually cut across the parties, so that there is potentially the beginnings of a return to the kind of coalitional politics that are necessary to make democracy work. That's the first thing, and that just has to happen, but it will inevitably happen over time. On top of that, then, we need to dismantle all of the institutional structures that exacerbate the polarization, and we'll keep it going if we don't dismantle them. And for what it's worth, that's where at the Hewlett Foundation, we have undertaken something we call the Madison Initiative, which is designed to work on those institutions, both with the idea that when the resorting takes place, it'll be able to be effective if we have dismantled them, and the dismantling of them itself is something that will push along that process. The last thing, which I'm just going to say, is I think the real hope, and is one of the things that's great about the United States is the endless capacity that this country has shown over 240 years to reinvent itself, and in particular to reinvent democratic politics. And I do think the biggest hope here for us, where the source of the resorting will be and where the source of renewed willingness to compromise comes in the younger generation. This is primarily, I hate to say it, I actually expect this is an older audience than I expected. So it's us. We're the ones who've done this. And in truth, the students I teach, the younger people I encounter, they do not like this. They do not agree with it. They do not feel quite as strongly about, that this is about which tribe you're in and so on. So that also will, I think, play out over time.
But neither do they vote.
Well, they'll get older and they'll start voting. No one said this is going to happen in a day.
Arlie, you're going to take us to the heart of our political divide.
Both you, David, and you, Larry, have focused on the question of polarization and how inclusive as a basic principle of democracy can we be if we're in two separate poles. Well, 5 years ago, I found myself teaching sociology in Berkeley, California, and in a bubble, in a pole. And it occurred to me that I lived in a geographic enclave, a media enclave, and a technological enclave. When I talked to my husband, my friends, my neighbors, I think this, you think that, we agreed. But I open the New York Times and think, oh my God, what's going on? And so I decided that I'd like to get out of my enclave and go as far to the right as Berkeley, California is to the left. And I thought, well, now where would that be? That would be in the South, where the right has grown the fastest. And who would it be? It would be among whites. So whites, South. It would be among older white South. And then I thought, well, where in the South? Well, in 2012, I saw the statistics of the proportion of whites that voted for Obama. And in California, it was a half. In the whole region of the South, former Confederacy, it was a third of whites who voted for Obama. But in Louisiana, it was 14%. I thought, perfect. And so the project became to take my political and moral alarm system off and to try and scale from the get-go what I thought of as an empathy wall, because I truly didn't get it, how the way of thinking, the premises, I didn't understand. So I went to Louisiana. I had one contact, who was the mother-in-law of a former graduate student at Berkeley. And she was progressive, but her best friend, lifelong friend, was Tea Party. They shared keys to each other's houses. Their children loved each other. They went to plays and art museums together. And I thought, well, what a model for undoing polarization here. Let me go look at that. Well, 5 years later, and 60 interviews later, and 40 friendships later, 4,600 pages of transcript later, I really did begin to get a feel for that other pole. And I want to say that I began with one question and ended with another. I began with the well-known red state paradox, that how could you have the poorest states, the states with the worst education, the worst health, the lowest life expectancy, and states that rely more on federal aid than they give in taxes, be the most disbelieving in the federal government, have the most suspicion of it, want less of it. Look, if you got these problems, wouldn't you want some help? I mean, that's the paradox. Louisiana was the super red state paradox because it was, in 2014, the poorest state in the union. 44% of the state budget came from the federal government, and it was mainly Tea Party and now enthusiastically Trump. So, perfect. Okay, this is who I really wanted to try and understand. And the environment became a keyhole issue for me. So that was the question that I went with. But once I got to know people, and what I would do, just briefly, would ask people, can I get to know you? I'd say, hi, I'm Arlie Hochschild. I teach sociology, Berkeley, California. I live in a bubble. I think you do too. The bubbles are getting farther apart. I'm here because I'd like to understand you. I think having gray hair helped. I mean, why else would I do this, you know? And they would say, because they believe in democracy too, they would say, well, thank you for coming. You know, we feel like you people think that we're the flyover state, that we're backward and racist, and you think that we're retrograde and uneducated and just hicks, rednecks. So thank you for coming to find out who we really are. And so there was a belief, too, in being an American. You know, you're an American, I'm an American. Thanks for coming. I thought I was reaching over to the empathy wall, but the truth is they were reaching back, much more than Southern hospitality, but they were interested in bridging this gap, too. They were, you know, in a geographic enclave. They were watching Fox News. They were in a media enclave, and very much an electronic one. If you looked at their their Facebook pages, a lot of the contributions reaffirmed their own positions. But in short, I went with one question, this red state paradox, which I discovered to them, they knew it, but it was less important than something else. And that something else is what I came to call the deep story. What's a deep story? A deep story is a story that feels true to you. It's a story from which you take out moral judgments, you take out facts. It's just how it feels. And I think under right-wing politics, there is one deep story. Under progressive politics, there's another deep story. We all have, I believe, deep stories. And theirs is that they're waiting in line, as in a pilgrimage to the top of a hill at which there's the American dream. They've worked hard, they've obeyed the rules, they feel like they deserve this dream. And they've been waiting a long time, and the line isn't moving. And then they see people moving, cutting in line is how they see it. And who would that be? Well, that would be blacks on affirmative action programs, blacks who now have access to jobs that used to be reserved for whites. Even worse, women who have cut ahead and in this narrative, and have access to jobs that used to be reserved for men. And then immigrants, refugees, even the oil-soaked, endangered brown pelican, state bird, they see us cutting ahead of them. Oh, you liberals put animals ahead of us people, is the construction. So, and here's the point, Barack Obama and the federal government, they see as waving hello and sponsoring all of these line cutters, so that they see the government as a giant instrument of their marginalization. Okay, so they feel like a minority group, except they don't believe in identity politics, and they don't want to say, look, I'm white and I'm male and I'm downwardly mobile and feel sorry for me. They keep saying, oh, well, I'm tired of all these poor me's. Everybody should just work and no cutting in line. So they feel like strangers in their own land. And that is what makes them feel in a poll. They believe in democracy, but they feel invisible. They don't feel represented. And so when Donald Trump, at the end of my book, very March, I was just finishing it up, Donald Trump comes into New Orleans for his primary rally, and I suddenly saw that for 4.5 years I'd been studying the kindling, and now I saw the match. That he was Pied Piper come in to represent the outsider, the forgotten, and flaws and all. So one more thing, the paradox I ended up with is one for the blue states. How could it be that the Democratic Party, which calls itself the party of the people, the party of the working man, is losing a lot of people and working men? What could be true that was on your list of comments to speak? What policies would speak to a sense of inclusion, which was, David, one of the premises foundational to America, for people who, to perhaps our surprise, feel excluded? Thank you.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks, David, for inviting me and for us. It's a distinguished group to be with. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out. I'll just make several observations. The first of which is David mentioned this, we're coming to the end of an epic saga. And it struck me that's the best description I could possibly, most euphemistic description I could think of. I think it's epic. I just don't think it's a saga. I think it's more of a train wreck. And Arlie referred to Donald Trump as a match. I'm in the peculiar position of being much more critical of the Republican nominee than anybody up here as a lifelong Republican. Larry said he was going to step out of politics. I'm going to step in it. And we can have a conversation about that during the Q&A. But let me make a couple of preliminary comments. The subject of the talk today is the future of democracy, and of course America, as we understand it, is a democracy, but in another sense and in a deeper sense, it's a republic too. So I do want to say that I think one of the failures that's happening, one of the concerns that strikes me, is that we're failing as a republic because, as the founders understood, Madison in particular, but really most of them, and if you read the Federalist Papers, they were concerned about direct democracy, and they were concerned about the passions of the people. They were concerned about mob mentality. So our system of government really was set up as checks and balances on that, as a way to filter out. And they believed in political leadership, and one of the roles of political leadership was to try and refine views and calm the passions down. And I do feel like that this election worries me for a number of reasons, but one of them is that the passions are being stoked up in a way that actually is unprecedented in my lifetime. I've been involved in politics my entire adult life. I've been involved in presidential campaigns, so I understand the intensity of these things. But we've never seen anything like this. And it's not simply the nature of the campaign between the two candidates, so it's being said, but it is, in my estimation, dark and ugly forces that are being stirred up in America, primarily by Donald Trump. And that's unusual in America. This country has been blessed. We've been insulated in a lot of ways from things that other countries have gone through. And so we're heading into a kind of territory that I think is unusual for us and worrisome. The second thing that I want to throw out, just in general about the state of our republic, the state of American democracy, I'm not of the apocalyptic mindset that this country is not going to collapse. Our political system is not going to collapse. This country has a tremendous capacity for self-renewal, and it's seen much, much harder times, as our resident historian David can tell you, than what we're experiencing now. The Civil War, perhaps, was a starting point, but a lot of others. Even the nature of the campaign and the negativity. I mean, you go back to the campaign of 1800 and Jefferson and Adams. You know, scholars will say that it nearly tore the young republic apart. So that's important to bring a perspective. I think too often people are loose in their language about the coming apocalypse. That said, I think that there are real and serious concerns. I think our political culture is sick and disfigured, and a lot of work needs to be done. I think our political leadership is weak almost across the board, and we have nominated the two least popular and least liked and least respected nominees in the history of modern polling. And whoever is going to win the presidency on January 20th, the country is going to be exhausted and deeply divided. And there has been very little political leadership that's been exercised to try and deal with the problems we face. And then our political institutions, which I think are largely out of touch with the concerns of our times. I think both parties would do themselves very well if they modernized and reformed. It seems like for Republicans, for the longest time, every day was January 20th, 1981, which is when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, and all the issues were from that era and all the solutions for that era. And for a lot of liberals, every day is January 20th, 1965, when Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office, and that was the beginning of what for liberalism was one of the high water marks, which was the Great Society. Whatever you think of Reagan and Johnson and the Great Society and the Reagan Revolution, those were a long time ago, and we're a different country now, and the problems we face are different. And I just have a sense, apropos of what Arlie was saying, that some of the frustration out there is the sense that our political parties and our political institutions are just not up to the moment that we face. But this is a low moment in politics. We're in a trough, undoubtedly. And that bothers me, I must say. I got into politics because I actually care about politics. I'm not a Pollyanna. I'm not naive. I understand that there are downsides to politics. I understand that there are mundane parts to politics. I understand that there are people that are, knaves and fools that come to politics. But that's true of every profession in human society, whether you're talking about lawyers or carpenters or doctors or anything else. But politics, finally, is also about justice. Madison says in Federalist 51 that the end of government is justice. And that is really what politics should, in some important respects, be about, which is the advance of human dignity, the advance of human flourishing, and certain high views of what we can be and what we can do together. And I would appreciate it, actually, if someone that's in politics actually defended it for a change. If the people who are themselves represent the political institutions aren't going to defend it and defend what it's about, then nobody else will do it either. And I do worry that a skepticism toward government and toward politics, which I understand, I'm a conservative philosophically, so I'm not opposed to that, but I do think that we've slid from skepticism to a kind of corrosive cynicism, and that is problematic. In terms of this current election, I think this year's been a bright red warning sign about American democracy, and as I said, I think both parties are badly out of touch with the public, including many of their own voters. And I think it's probably not useful to think outside of the frame of the two-party system when we think about the future of American democracy. And so let me just conclude my preliminary comments with my party, the Republican Party. So as David said, I worked in the last 3 Republican administrations. I was in the George W. Bush White House for 7 years. My first vote was cast for Ronald Reagan. So it's a party I've been a part of. I'm not primarily a Republican. I'm actually more of a conservative. That's just my bent. But the Republican Party has historically been, in my lifetime, the political home of that. So this is a problematic time for the party and difficult for me. I will say that any party that nominates Donald Trump as its nominee should engage in a little self-reflection. And and I think that's necessary. I have talked, by the way, to a lot of Trump supporters, friends of mine, still friends of mine, and not just to debate them, we were talking about this earlier, but to try and listen to them, to try and understand what their story is, and to ask them, what is it about Donald Trump that you think that I don't see and need to see? Because I've been very public and very vocal and very early in my criticisms of Trump, and we can go in during our discussion, because they do have a story to tell, and these are not bad people. By and large, but I do think they're wrong. And when David said that the whole country, that Trump is in a sense an indictment of the whole country, or an example of the whole country's failure, maybe we'll see what happens a week from now. But it's primarily a Republican Party failure, because we produced him, and we're going to have to live with him. And I want to just touch briefly on what I think are three things that have happened that in the Republican Party that has allowed for the rise of Trump. One is a kind of anti-intellectualism that's taken hold. So when I was a young conservative, one of the things that drew me to the party was that the Republican Party, in the words of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a great Democratic senator, served people of both parties. He's a great liberal, and he wrote, it was actually in the New York Times in 1981, he said, of a sudden, the Republican Party had become the party of ideas. And I think he was right. And so back in the 1980s, you had figures like Charles Murray on welfare, and James Q. Wilson on crime, and Richard John Neuhaus on religion and public life, and Alan Bloom on the universities. And whatever you thought of their views, these were serious thinkers who made, I think, serious contributions to the public debate and our public understanding. And I think over time there's just been a devaluing of serious ideas within the Republican Party. I don't know that you can pinpoint any particular moment that it happened. I think it happened over time. But I do think that there's a personification of it that we saw, which was with Sarah Palin. And I have my disagreements with President Obama, but I do think he was right when he said you can draw a straight line from Sarah Palin to Donald Trump. There is a kind of trendy benightedness that exists within some elements of the Republican Party. And I didn't think you get worse than Sarah Palin when it came to public policy, but you can. So we've got a nominee who can't string three serious public policy sentences together, and that's a problem. I actually think one of the reasons why Trump runs the way he does, it's just the theatrics of politics, very bad theatrics, but there's a theatrical element to it, is because he's actually frightened of any discussion on public policy, because he's utterly non-conversant. It's interesting, if you watched the debates as I did, I think I saw every one, or it seemed like I did. Anyway, they never ended. The only time that Donald Trump would recede in those debates is if there was a discussion about policy, and he would pull back because he knew that he didn't know anything about it. So I think that's one thing. The second is a kind of destructive political mindset that's taken root in elements of the Republican Party. And it's a kind of relentless combativeness and an intemperance and a deep hostility to really what Larry was talking about, which is compromise and what I would term as a kind of a moderate characteristic or temperament or attitude, moderation in that sense. He's quite right. This really is actually in the American DNA, compromise. It's really what the founders set up as our system. And they set it up that way for all sorts of reasons, primarily because they were worried about the centralization of power. But the more I've thought about this question, the more I've come to believe in the importance of a certain kind of modesty or humility as we approach things. And I'm speaking very much to myself here on these matters too. I believe in objective truth, but I also believe that none of us has anything like a full apprehension of what truth is. We all come at these things at a certain angle of vision. And one of the things that you do in the engagement with other people is that they help enlarge your angle of vision. They help you see things a little bit better, and the lens is a little bit wider than you would otherwise do. And something odd happened in the course of sort of political debates, which is people engage in them to win rather than to better understand the truth. I was reading, it's a lovely book called The Fellowship. It's on the Inklings, which was in England in the 20th century, and it was a group of literary people, including C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien primarily, but also Owen Barfield and Charles Williams. And one of the things that I thought was really beautiful about the book was the friendships that they had. One of the reasons that their friendships were so special is they actually did not see everything the same way, and they learned from each other. And they felt like in that kind of back and forth, they took smaller steps toward their apprehension to see the reality of things. And I think that it really is important to get back. But in the Republican Party, I think that there is a kind of hostility to compromise, and that combativeness, a word that you would hear a lot, would be just fight. They want their people to fight. And this led to the 2013 government shutdown, which was silly and politically self-destructive, and by the way, wouldn't have even worked on its own grounds, right? The argument was if you shut down the government to defund the Affordable Care Act, number one, President Obama was never going to sign a bill that would defund something called Obamacare. But apart from that, it's primarily an entitlement program, and if you shut down the government, you shut down discretionary spending, not entitlement spending. So even on its own merits, which is shutting down the government, you wouldn't have defunded the Affordable Care Act. But that didn't matter. And in addition to that, there's this growing appeal of conspiracy theories. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal in 2011 on Donald Trump and birtherism, saying if you play footsie with something like this, you're going to pay a cost. But I wouldn't have guessed in 1,000 years that we would end up nominating as our nominee the person who was the primary exponent and apostle of this sort of crazy racist conspiracy theories. And it doesn't end there. His conspiracy theories are far and wide. And then the third thing is a sort of appeal to nativism and xenophobia. I was an advocate of comprehensive immigration reform, but I never felt in those debates that the opponents of them were nativist. I understood the frustrations that people have with illegal immigration. I understand the concerns people have about assimilation, even with legal immigration. And I didn't think it was helpful to try and turn that debate into a sort of series of ad hominem attacks. But at the same time, this can't be denied, which is the Republican nominee began his campaign to be president by appealing to nativism. He went down the escalator and into the swamp, and he hadn't stopped. And he was not sotto voce about this. This is not a man who hid his views and then at the end, after he got the nomination, said, I'm going to spring this on you. He ran on this stuff, and every time he seemed to get in a jam, there was something new that he pulled out of his bag of tricks, whether it was the Muslim ban or something else about Mexicans. And so it was pretty ugly stuff. David will speak to this better than I. When there are people who are frustrated and feel that their stories aren't being heard and their struggles aren't being understood, it's not unprecedented that demagogues emerge and take advantage of that. Though in this country, for that to happen for a presidential candidate, it is unusual. George Wallace in '68, but he was not the nominee of the Democratic Party at that time. But I really think that the great sin for the Republican Party isn't just or even primarily that Trump won the nomination, but it is that people who knew better rallied around him after he won the nomination. They really do, I think, know better, but for a variety of reasons, some better than others, but I think cowardice and fear They didn't stand up to him, and so Donald Trump's corruptions became theirs. And that's not going to go away no matter what happens on November 8th. If Donald Trump wins, God help us, but if he does, I suspect over time the Republican Party will shatter, at least as the party that we know, because at least some group of us, never Trumpers, would leave the party because we don't have our allegiance primarily to a party. It's actually to a set of ideas and ideals, the good of the whole. The prophet Jeremiah talked about the welfare of the city, and that matters more than the party that you belong to. So if he wins, I think there will be a crack up. If he loses, and I still think that he will, I think there will be a massive reconstruction of the Republican Party. I know where I'm going to be in that battle, and I know where other people are going to be. I think it's going to be intense and difficult. I hope it's within the confines of civilized, but it probably won't be at certain times. It's probably good to keep the sentiments of my favorite president, Abraham Lincoln, in mind, who emerged from a lot worse confrontation than this. And talked about with malice toward none and with charity towards all, and he spoke about us being not enemies but friends, and that's not a bad ethos for us to adopt, both as Republicans, but really more importantly as Americans, because these are tough times, but we are one country and we are one people. And there's a lot of important good to do, and we really ought to get on with that task.
So, Peter, I can't resist telling you, maybe you already know, many people here will know, that in a commencement address here at Stanford last June, filmmaker Ken Burns was our commencement speaker, and he got quite political, in ways kind of unusual on those occasions, and he referred to those members of the Republican Party leadership who did not distance themselves from Trump. This is not you. He had a very colorful phrase for it. He called them Vichy Republicans.
Yeah.
Referring to the government of France during World War II.
Yeah.
Let's just say that I think the prediction was made that Trump loses. Those people who have hitched their wagon to his star, what will become of them in the Republican Party going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really depends on which ones you're talking about, because there are people who are reluctant Trump supporters, and I can tell you what their stories are, which is these are people that will say, he really bothers me. He was my last choice to be a Republican nominee, but they are conservative in their views, and Hillary Clinton is liberal, and they feel like that on a whole series of policies that they care deeply about, from the Supreme Court on down, that she's going to govern to the left. And they feel like there will be more damage done to the Republic if Hillary Clinton is president than if Donald Trump is. I disagree with that for reasons I'm happy to go into. He's crazy. Now, so I'm done with that. But it's actually a disordered personality, and I'm not kidding there. It's sociopathy. So I know I'm outside of my field of expertise, but I've talked to enough people. So for me, you don't really have to go too much beyond that to say, no, I've worked closely with the president for 7 years. I've come to believe, as I've spent more time in politics, that the primary requirement when you're thinking about electing a president is temperament, disposition, prudence. Because there's so many issues you just simply cannot anticipate that a president will deal with. And I've spent my life in public policy. It matters where they stand on it. It matters where you check the box. But it matters more important what your temperament is. And there's just been nobody that's ever been.
I want to actually pull back a minute, because it's for two reasons. One is, of course, focusing on Trump is like shooting fish in a barrel. So it doesn't, in a way, it's not really getting at the heart of what is really at issue here. That's what I mean. I mean, this election is exceptional. And of course, we have Peter here, who is a Republican, being critical. And for this audience in particular, I think it's really important for people to understand something, which is this is not the fault of the Republicans. Something David said is quite right. The we are all to blame is you have to understand this as a long-term phenomenon in which we've been on a kind of spiral downward. So what matters in American politics is who controls the executive. That's where the initiative in government is, and the party that does not control the executive is on the defensive in Congress. That's invariably been the case. And what we've seen is, and that's what I mean, it only became visible more recently, but this started with Nixon. The Democrats in Congress under Nixon began to do things that were different in Congress than what had been done in the earlier period. The Republicans under Carter were a little worse. The Democrats under Reagan were still worse. Reagan, let's see, we go to Clinton, the Republicans under Clinton, that's when it begins to become noticeable. But the Democrats under Bush took things, with the very large, I grant you, exception of impeachment, took things a whole nother level. It was the Democrats in that period that began the abuse of the filibuster, that began the serious use of the debt limit as a bargaining tool and threatening to shut down the government. And the reason the Republicans seem so much worse is because the Democrats have controlled the executive for 16 of the last 24 years. But do you not think that if Trump were to actually win, that the Democrats in Congress in the next phase would take up where the Republicans have left off and carry it on still further? And that's the dynamic we gotta recognize. It's just too easy to say this is the Republicans' fault and we just need them to fix themselves. That's really not the situation.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say, there's this new book out by Thomas Frank, Listen Liberal, which goes along really with what you're saying, that the Democrats and Republicans have really separated out into two different social classes of white, and that Democratic whites are more highly educated and advanced degrees. That's who the Democratic whites are, but the Republican whites tend to be high school educated or less. So and then you get two different attitudes toward policies. And he's basically arguing that we have to deal with that class divide, and that if you can embrace trade policies that actually are fine to speed up globalization. If you're a Silicon Valley, hotshot startup person, you're doing fine. This will be fine. But those trade policies that close down the industrial sector and make life hard for pipe fitters is not fine. So that there is a connection to.
Can I try and stitch together something that you put on the table, Larry, namely the value of compromise, with some of the early framing comments, and I want to direct this question ultimately to you, Arlie. So, as a political philosopher, political philosophers inclined to say that democracy or democratic governance has at least two things to recommend it over alternatives. The first is, as David put it in his introduction, it's an especially fair process because it rests with the people themselves, the ultimate legitimacy of the government, as opposed to alternative systems which the people aren't the source of legitimacy. And then secondly, people will say that democratic governance is also especially good compared to the alternatives at delivering better outcomes, that democratic institutions are wiser on balance than the alternatives. And it's on that latter score that I think the value of compromise is especially important. And if it's an inaction of government, an inability to problem solve, especially at the federal level that we see, Arlie, I'm interested in having you take us back to the people you spent time with in Louisiana to reflect on whether you saw compromise, problem solving, either amongst people in a very local way, in a Tocquevillian spirit perhaps, or in actual operations of government. So when you described the mindset, the deep story of people on a long line to the American dream at the top of the hill, and they see a whole bunch of people cutting in front of them. Well, if it's the right thing that blacks should have an opportunity for the American dream, that women should be able to work, that immigrants, a country of immigrants, we should have some in there. Maybe even the poor oil-stained pelican deserves something too.
Right.
What's the problem-solving orientation or the compromise capacity of the people you spent time with?
Great question. Within the community they lived in, and they were locals, who were their best friends, their neighbors, and their co-parishioners at the church. So that you have your coastal cosmopolitans and you have your inland locals, you could say. And there was tremendous capacity for compromise and cooperation within their local communities. One man featured in the book begins with him. He was born on a sugar plantation, worked in oil all his life, and something terrible happened to him in an environmental disaster. He became an environmentalist. He said, I know, it's a sort of a liberal thing to become an environmentalist, but he compromised to do it, and now has some good friends who are liberals in the small, embattled environmental community in Louisiana. But there was recently a terrible storm and flooding around Baton Rouge, and they talked about the Cajun Navy. So fishermen came and they got their boats together and they rescued people. And because the houses were so soaked and could quickly get mildew, people just volunteered to pull off the siding and put it in the side of the road. All of this volunteer cooperation. Then they complained. I got a lot of email about this, that, well, now the government says you need a license to get in your boat and use it to rescue people. So you have to pay. This stupid government is, horning in and abusing our precious capacity to compromise. So from their point of view, that was just, and I agree. I mean, that was, what a stupid, terrible thing.
One more pass on this, and inviting Larry and Peter into conversation here. So, Larry, you mentioned the ways in which the rules of Congress and the mechanism of doing business has changed in such a way that Republicans and Democrats don't hang out with each other as much anymore. We've got this residential and ideological sorting, the red state, blue state phenomenon. So Arlie, if one of the lessons, which I think you were suggesting before, that it's actual human contact and dense interaction in, if not daily life, at least the ability to cross a certain type of political or ideological divide and scale this empathy wall. We don't see it so much in Congress because people don't hang out across these party lines so much anymore. We don't see it where we happen to sort ourselves where we live anymore. So are these human connections essential features to compromise and problem solving that in the absence of we shouldn't expect other structural features or fixes to remedy? How much do we need to be ideologically common in our places of residence and universities and workplaces in order to get stuff done?
Well, that's a great question. I do believe, without being simplistic about it, that human connection and empathy as a basic quality where you actually get curious and open to know another person is elemental to setting down the first step to reach across to other people. And I think that Donald Trump is not, by the way, capable of empathy. Go back to the mental illness question. So the blue state paradox that, progressives and the Democratic Party is too turned in on itself and is losing some natural allies, actually, and not reaching across and not being open to compromise, I think calls on us, that is to say, the Democratic side, to do some reaching out. And I think through schools, through churches, through unions, through, there's something that MoveOn.org has started, these living room conversations where you get a Tea Party person together with a liberal and you begin to break bread together. But I found the best conversations I had were out in a boat fishing after a can of beer. That was, I'll tell you, it was so precious. Here's this Tea Party person, super Trump person. He just was completely diehard. And look at his Facebook page, you think, oh, gee, whoa. But that same person, we're reeling in, he said, we have to get money out of politics. I said, well, you have a lot of people in California who would agree with that. That would be, campaign finance reform. And he said, yeah, and our leaders are trying to pull us apart. and make their reputations on polarization. That's not good for the whole country. Again, I said, good, I agree with that. He said the environment, why is that a left-wing cause? How silly is that? Shouldn't that be, don't we all want clean air and clean water? And it wasn't even just particular issues. He was for reducing prison populations. He was for decriminalizing marijuana. Here is this super Trump person. And about Bernie Sanders, he said, oh, Uncle Bernie. Pie in the sky, socialist, he just is unrealistic. But he felt a kinship. So I thought, well, here's a tip-off. Why are we so separated? There is a real opportunity, and the shoe is on our foot. That is the blue state paradox, I think, to reach across.
Larry or Peter?
So let me just offer. There's so many thoughts in there, but I think it's so. There's just a couple things to sort of recognize. One is the polarization, which started at the national level, is metastasizing down. So what the data show is, it has been the case that it has been easier to compromise and get things done at the local level and then at the state level, and it's getting worse. And the reason it's getting worse is political leadership matters a lot. So, Rob, in answer to your question, democracy cannot depend on face-to-face contact, because as soon as you're large, you can't have face-to-face contact. So what it has depended on is a kind of identification and empathy without necessarily knowing the person, and that comes through political leadership. So to take the example of gun control, right? There was that famous survey, 90% of the country thought background checks were reasonable, and yet the Republicans opposed it and did not suffer at the ballot box for that. Same thing with climate change. Over 60% of Republican voters accept that climate change is happening, that it's man-made, that something needs to be done about it, and yet there's no punishment at the ballot box, and that's because of the tribalism aspect, which is they are less willing to go along with the solution if it is supported by the other side, even if they think it's the right solution, right? And that's the phenomenon, and of course that's where leadership models and can either help or hurt, and we have been hurt horribly by the leadership on both sides. I mean, one other fact that's worth knowing, which is, again, there's this tendency to think, Republicans, they always say they're not willing to compromise. Democrats are different that way. And it's true if you ask the question, are you willing to compromise? But there have been a bunch of studies done where if you give people actual scenarios and ask them, Democrats are no more willing to compromise than Republicans. And again, you fall back on this where they're particularly not willing to compromise is if it's what the other side wants or is willing to do. And that runs both ways. And that's what we need to change, and we're not going to do it through face-to-face contact. It's going to have to be a product of leadership.
Yeah, but Larry,
I don't agree with that. Yeah.
Larry, I think that's a false equivalence, quite bluntly, over the last 20 years. And I'm your friend and colleague of many years, but I just think that's a false equivalence. But the question, I really do. I just don't think that they're the same.
I know all dedicated Democrats
and it's just like saying that Hillary Clinton on the one hand, Donald Trump on the other hand, and that the media has done. But my broader question to you, all of you, is this is about the future of democracy. And it seems like what you're boiling it down to is either it's about people and leadership, either we're going to get better leadership and better people, or institutions. And I think some of David, your earliest question about that. So this sort of the simple question I want to ask all of you is it about the fact that we've had really lousy leadership in many cases? And again, in my opinion, it is false equivalence to compare the Republican Party of the last 15 or 20 years to the Democratic leadership. And you can agree or disagree with that, but I don't. That's my own personal opinion. But is it about people, or is it the institutions themselves have begun to fail us?
Or is it either? Why either or? I guess that's my difference with you. You're saying, forget the people.
No. It is absolutely both.
Oh, okay.
But people are shaped by institutions. Institutions shape people.
So people vote for leaders. Yeah. Okay.
And Peter, what would you say? The same thing?
Yeah, I think it is. I just want to say a few brief words on compromise, because I sort of laid my cards on the table. I believe in it, and I believe polarization is a problem, but I want to disaggregate a little bit. I would disaggregate between saying that there's not compromise going on and there's inaction of government. I mean, the reality is that Barack Obama in his first 2 years got more done legislatively than anybody since Lyndon Johnson did. He had the Affordable Care Act, he had the stimulus package, he had cash for clunkers. And indeed, the 2010 midterm election was a very strong reaction to how active government was, in the sense that the Affordable Care Act was not popular, and it's still not. So I wouldn't say that just because you don't have compromise, government is inactive. It's in fact been very active. Second is, I think a lot of the frustration that the public has is not simply because of the process of government, the aesthetics of government. It's the sense that people have that things aren't succeeding. I'm just telling you, if we had 3.9 or 4.2% growth, a lot of these problems would be gone. What's the problem here?
Except the polarization continued to exacerbate when we did have that.
No, I don't. I'm not arguing that the polarization didn't exacerbate. What I'm saying is that the public's frustration is not derived because necessarily of polarization or compromise alone. It's a combination of those things going on, with a sense that for 15 years we have had low economic growth, flat wages, and other things. If the condition of people in their everyday life is stronger, then lack of compromise or polarization, it doesn't matter as much.
Nothing succeeds like success.
Right, and if you're succeeding as a country, people feel better in their lives, those things may matter, but it won't matter as much. And the last thing I'll say about compromise is, compromise in some respects just depends on where you sit and where you stand. And it is true that some of the great figures in American history are great, not just because of compromise, but because their stands on behalf, in some cases, of justice. Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, FDR. These people were significant figures because they pushed things that they believed in. And history is the judge of whether you're being stubborn and unprincipled, or whether you're being principled and steadfast, right? And if you go back and read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham city jail, he was not arguing for compromise, he was arguing for justice. And you remember who he wrote that letter to? It was 12 white ministers who were not racists. What they were arguing for was, don't go so fast. Just don't upset the system. And Martin Luther King, in a letter from Birmingham City Jail, said essentially, it's a fantastic, it's one of the great documents in American history, said that justice can't wait. So we just have to keep that in mind. Compromise is important. It's part of the American DNA, but it's not primus inter pares, and it depends. If you're talking about compromise, on behalf of justice, that can be a problem.
Peter, your invocation of Martin Luther King, particularly the letter from the Birmingham jail, reminds me of something that you mentioned, Arlie, about the folks you dealt with there in Louisiana. And that is Martin Luther King's basic appeal, as I read it historically, was to ask the country to stand up and practice what it doctrinally professed to believe in. So there was an underlying consensus on the value of fairness without respect to race that the country was summoned to honor in actual practice. And you remember Gunnar Myrdal's famous book about an American dilemma. He described this as the American creed, and he said even the most weather-beaten racist redneck up there in the hollers of Appalachia, somewhere down in his being believes in this basic creed of the dignity of every individual and fairness. So this fairness, it seems to me, is a touchstone. And if you go back to the person who's frequently cited as the original populist in our political traditions, Andrew Jackson. If you read his veto message when he vetoed the Bank of the United States legislation, it shot through with considerations of fairness and how ordinary people have a right to complain when the power of the government is aligned not behind them, but by this bank and all the financiers and the aristocrats and so on and so forth. It's absolutely a touchstone. So if we're in agreement that fairness is one of the most powerful animating values in our tradition, and I think we'd probably get pretty widespread agreement about that, what has happened in the last couple of generations that has convinced so many people that the system is not fair? I mean, what one could, I'm going to be a little provocative here, but just to put something in the hopper that may get you to respond. What about the history of the tortured history of affirmative action? That has raised questions of fairness from top to bottom, and possibly that is one of the root causes of the dilemma we're in.
You're right. I came home to think about that, that this, you could say that the people I met believed, number one, very strongly in fairness, and they felt that that the government had been unfair, not to blacks, but to them. So same value, but reapplied. And it was like affirmative action run amok. And so that's what the deep story says. You know, these people are getting ahead of me because I'm not getting anywhere. That fits in with your stall in the economy. And they're not looking over the hill to look at you know, the state of capitalism and automation and offshoring, and they're not looking at other causes for that stall. Yeah, I think ultimately empathy is the first stage, but the second is to begin a conversation about why we had affirmative action in the first place. What is fairness with regard to people that have been shut out of that system? I feel like in the South, that conversation stopped 30 years ago. It's like, I'll give you an example. Again, we're out in the boat, different person. And
Same boat?
No, different boat.
Same beer?
Yeah, same beer. It came up about race, and this man said, you know, I'm a reformed bigot. He said, I said, well, what's a bigot? Well, a bigot is someone who uses the N-word and who hates blacks. He said, I never hated blacks. I did use the N-word back in 1966, but everybody else used it too. But in 1967, I remember I stopped using it, and today, if someone uses that word on my Facebook page, off they go. I'm offended by it. It's not who I am. And then I said, well, what was it like when your high school was integrated? So we're talking about Donaldsonville High. This is in the lower ranks of the Mississippi River, now called Cancer Alley. He's there at high school, and in his sophomore year, he said, I had one black entered my class. By the senior year, it was half black. And I asked him, well, so did you make any new friends? And you know what his answer was? There was a very long pause. And he said, you're making me think. I liked that answer very much. I liked it because it was open. We're all in moments of transition here, but somehow the trust that had been built up allowed him kind of the space to reflect on it. And we just need more of those open conversations. Not to say that leaders don't matter, for sure, but people in a democracy elect those leaders. And if they're having those conversations, we'll be better off.
And I have a follow-up to all of you on this, which is Larry said very thoughtfully earlier about media fragmentation, and that social media in particular turned political opposition into tribalism. Don't you think, and that a lot of this has come out of the media polarization and the fact that you can just hide in your little enclave, media-wise now? I mean, I thought Larry's point about that was completely relevant to all the questions you're asking.
I found a woman who said about Fox News, oh, Fox is family. What did she mean? Well, she meant that Bill O'Reilly was daddy, and that Hannity was the acerbic uncle, and that Megyn Kelly was the smartass sister. And she had this whole family iconography. And when we went out in a car, you turned the ignition and Fox News came on. And then we go to her desk, there was a little TV, and Fox News was on. At 5:30 with her husband, glass of wine, Fox News was on. So there is, they call it the confirmation effect, where you're looking to, and we do it too, you know, look to have your worldview confirmed as something reassuring about it. And Fox is not only confirming it, but pushing the conspiratorial end of it. And yeah,
So
that was definitely there.
We're approaching our deadline here, which is a kind of a drop-dead deadline. So how about if we take the last few minutes, we just put to each of you a simple question: what is a single priority, actionable, realistic thing we can do in the we the American people can do in the near future to upgrade our democracy? Larry, you want to
Start at that end this time.
Go.
I didn't think about that.
Peter, he's calling on you.
You go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Single most, that's what makes it hard. But I could say most immediate, if I can answer a question I wasn't asked.
And realistic now.
Yeah, realistic is get out of our enclaves. I think people to people, just get out of your comfort zone and discover some people who want to get out of theirs. And don't just feel that all of the bad angels in people's hearts that Trump has called forth and saturated our mass media and picture of ourselves with is all that's there. There are good people on the other side. Let's get to know them.
Peter, have you had enough time?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I'm not sure if it's the single most important. I just think as a kind of human experience, it's important to do, and it does take the edge off of a lot of politics and the personalization. I don't know procedurally. I mean, Larry may have better, and the rest of them what needs to be done. I think probably just to come back to something I said earlier is to hearken back a little bit to to think through what the purposes of politics is, which is some approximation of justice and the common good. And to the degree that we can pull back from what our narrow self-interest is and understand what that is, and even that's important to do, and to act on those kind of passions and animating principles would be a good start, because I do think that we've kind of lost that.
Yeah.
And it may sound a little bit high-minded, but if you're in a boat, you have to have some sense of what you're aiming to get to on the other shore. If you don't have that, then you're just going to go in circles or off course. And I think that we've actually, for reasons that are too complicated to get into, and even beyond my ability to understand them, I think we've lost some of that.
Larry, you get the
I
last
can be
word.
very quick, because I think, like all major political developments, this one is incredibly overdetermined. So I don't think there's one thing we can do. I think there are a whole bunch of things, and we need to change them all.
Where would you start?
I would start where we're starting in the Madison Initiative, simultaneously with Congress, with primary elections, with campaign finance, and with media.
My candidate would be to peel back the Gingrich-era reforms in the way Congress does business. I think you mentioned the same thing.
Yeah, those were bad.
That's a place to start.
Those were bad.
Well, thank you all.